as I was saying about Shaykh Seraj and his community, so it was 100 years that they developed this really organically rooted community, and at the same time being very, very connected to a system of religious authority that was based in Mecca, but that they created something completely of their own. And I find that quite fascinating that this very small community in South Africa, very shortly after the ending of slavery, also then into the apartheid era, was able to do that. And then also able at the same time to be not only socially relevant, but also very deftly, I have to say, politically so as well. And I won't go too much into South Africa here, but there were Muslims who were quite okay with the apartheid regime for a bunch of different reasons. The Arzoo Institute was not like that, but they also weren't political activists, right? Even though there were many in the Zawiya who were, but as the Mashayikh of the Zawiya, they weren't. So I remember very clearly talking to Shaykh Seraj about his days in the anti-apartheid movement, because before he was one of the sheikhs of the Zawiya, he was somebody who went on protests, was arrested, was thrown in jail for a time. And one of his uncles took a particular stance when it came to whether or not they'd be classified as white under this particular regime, which is a very, on one level fascinating, on another entirely grotesque. But said, no, we're not going to pass in order to benefit from the privileges that we would accrue, right? So they definitely took, in a very deft way, I have to say, the Zawiya never was a place where there'd be political activism from the mimbar, but it was very clear that there were many inside the Zawiya who engaged very widely in social and political life, but very much as Cape Townians, very much as South Africans, which I also found incredibly intriguing. And I found this intriguing on a personal level as well, because when I first met Shaykh Seraj, it was 2009, and of course a couple of years later was the beginning of the Arab Spring revolutionary uprisings. So that also brought a lot of things that we would discuss. And what I hope we will get out of today is at least some sort of discussion around how you root that kind of religious authority in a new place, and of course it was new there, and at the same time it's not all new. So Shaykh Seraj was Cape Malay, which means that he inherited certain traditions and vocabulary, words, language, customs from the Malay archipelago, the Nusantara as they say. So it wasn't something that, cut off from that either. In the same way that also, going back to the Nusantara, you still find, have you been successful?
Just restarted the session.
Okay, well we'll continue, and if it works then that'll be great. Where you still see inheritances of that Yemeni influence that originally came to that part of the world. So they didn't say, we're just going to throw this behind us. They kept a lot of it, and you see it in a lot of the customs, you see it in some of the language, you see it in part of the dress and the culture, and that's all fine, right? That's not something that was deemed to be, no, we have to get rid of all this stuff and jettison it or something. They created something quite new, and also at the same something quite old. And seeing how they navigated that, again, as a minority community, and I've studied minority Muslim communities all the world, it was a very rooted, I know I keep mentioning this, but it just felt so rooted and normal, I was perhaps quite spoiled, I have to say, because I spent a lot of time with that community, understanding it, learning from it, and I'm sure that in other parts of Cape Town they probably had all sorts of problems, and they probably had problems in that community as well, but didn't tell me about them. So I'm sure I've got a rosy sort of picture of this, but it was really interesting just to see people very at ease and comfortable with their surroundings, but also with how religious authority could actually be not something so far away, something that was deeply about here, and also not something that, jettisoned tradition or anything like that. It was something that was just really part and parcel of what it meant to be a Muslim South African.
Recording in progress.
Okay. So with that's my spiel, as it were. I did bring copies of the book for people that want to purchase them at the back afterwards, but I really just wanted to have this discussion about these sorts of themes, and with that I will pass over to the next panelist.
Thanks. Yes, I think that the question of the various Muslim minorities in South Africa raises some fairly fundamental questions, some of which are applicable to our admittedly different demographics here in the UK. One of them is that there are two major concentrations of Muslims in the Republic of South Africa who share much history, the history of the Dutch and then the British Empire, then the experience of the apartheid regime, and then ANC rule for the last 30 years. And yet they are very dissimilar in terms of their relationship to local identity and in their relationship to the process of inculturation. So in KwaZulu-Natal and the Transvaal, the culture which originates in the late 19th century with partly indentured movements of labourers from Western India, the culture remains doggedly separatist. The assumption is that Urdu should be the language of religious instruction, even though it was never really the language of the migrants who came largely from Gujarat in the 1880s and 1890s. In Johannesburg, at the Majlis al-Ulama, I met a Zulu imam who had to learn Urdu in order to study Islam in his own country. And there's very little sign that that is being dislodged. The Urdu-speaking communities in Durban, Port Elizabeth in particular, generally collaborated with the apartheid system and benefited quite significantly from it. Intermarriage amongst those communities with other demographies, particularly with African communities, still extremely unusual. The movement of Islam into townships, into indigenous languages, into the indigenous cultural space, quite hard to find, although that's beginning to start. But still there's a good deal of subcontinental racism, particularly against African communities in those places, which was reported to me by the populations themselves. On the other hand, not so far away, in Cape Province, you have the completely different experience of the Cape Malays. As Hisham has mentioned, certainly not an angelic community, and one that has been through all manner of traumas historically, originating as far back as the 17th century in the movement by the Dutch of slaves, including many ulama from what became the Dutch East Indies, and the development of this extraordinary ring of kramats, Muslim shrines, around the city of Cape Town, which are taken to be the protection of the city. One on Robben Island was regularly visited by Nelson Mandela, for instance, who found it a very peaceful and comforting place during his years of imprisonment. And the experience of being slaves, the experience of switching to the use of Afrikaans, even for liturgical purposes, meant that when freedom came in the early 19th century, you have already a very intermarried and hybridized community, which then went on to produce these very remarkable liturgical forms. The Border of Bokap, which is the main ex-slave district in Cape Town, is a very remarkable musicological, very sophisticated performance that they've managed since the early 19th century. Then the movement of those communities to newer areas such as Walmer Estate, where the Zawiya is located, and then the subsequent traumas of being shifted again thanks to the Group Areas Act. So the Zawiya is in a very ethnically traumatized, displaced, attenuated area. It's mostly what they call Cape coloured, but there's Cape Malay communities there who overlap with it. There's indigenous African communities. There's a white settlement there. It's really, everybody is in the warmer estate. And the development of liturgical forms since the 1920s, 1930s at the Zawiya, in which you find, and the untrained ear even can detect this, in their Barzanji Maulid, or in their Borda, or in their indigenous recitals, the sound unmistakably of missionary hymns, because the harmonies that they use, not usual in Islamic music, but they've incorporated at least three-part harmony quite well and interestingly. But not just the Dutch Calvinist sound, but also the indigenous Khoisin and Hottentot sound into that. It's definitely an African sound. The incorporation of the remains of their Cape Malay and Indonesian, mainly Javanese, heritage is a very extraordinary fusion of different worlds that has been incorporated really into their liturgical life and even into their traditional styles of tajweed, Quran recitation in the mosque. They were generally opposed to the apartheid system in South Africa, although as Hisham mentioned, Shaykh Seraj and his uncle, Shaykh Mehdi Hendricks, were also offered white status, which would open all kinds of doors of fulfillment and advancement to them, but they turned it down. And a community that continues to be open to intermarriage, and where the mosques are places where you will find an ethnic diversity, which in the more subcontinental communities is something that is still happening only slowly. Whether this can be attributed in any way to the different denominational heritage of those communities is something that I can't really decide. The strictly Deobandi pro-apartheid reality of 1970s, 1980s KwaZulu-Natal against, as it were, the very pluralistic world of the Shadali, Shafi'i, Ash'ari, assimilationist Cape Malays, two very different points in the Muslim spectrum. To what extent is there a fiqh or suli or Sufi basis to this greater willingness to identify culturally as well as nationally with South Africa that you find in these Cape Malay communities? Not sure, but it might be an interesting thing to talk about. And then, again, as Hisham mentioned, the very interesting connection that they had with Mecca, first of all in the Ottoman times, when Mecca was a much more cosmopolitan place than it became after 1926, and then subsequently after the Saudi occupation of the holy cities, still maintaining a connection with those traditional Meccan scholars who had not fallen in line with the official Najdi curriculum. An interesting example of globalization, which historically was rooted in the Islamic world, in the city of Mecca, pilgrimage patterns, visiting scholars and so forth, actually continuing after the Wahhabi conquest, when the conventional wisdom is that that just came to an end and it became the megaphone for the broadcasting of a simply monovocal Salafist type of Islam. It wasn't quite as simple as that. Mecca still remained a plurivocal and globalizing city, albeit, of course, in a discreet and non-official way. That was something that I also found interesting. But that narrative, that Meccan Arab Islam, never was allowed to deflect the Cape Malay communities from their identity as sort of indigenous, hybridized, African, Malay, white, intermarried with everybody. Their DNA tests are always remarkable. One of the most intermarried communities in the world, I imagine. It said that the connection with an Arabic centre never got in the way of this idea of inculturation and assimilation to local, not just South African, but specifically Cape Townian cultural norms. I found that an interesting way in which the universal and the particular managed to be juxtaposed without any evident friction.
And of course, we have somebody here who's just finished, I'm sure what will turn out to be an excellent work on the intellectual history of the Hijaz. He's very upset with me right now because I'm pointing him out, but Dr. Ma'an al-Dabbagh, who is now Dr. Ma'an al-Dabbagh, inshallah, the next PhD ceremonies has finished, and we're all looking forward to seeing his PhD in print. I know he's leaving as soon as the event is over, so I can get away with this. Otherwise, I get into a lot of trouble. With that, Dr. As, Bismillah.
Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. I don't think I have really very much to add, other than, in addition to what our two very erudite speakers before me, and Mashayikh before me, have mentioned. I will lay claim to being the most South African among this panel. I've lived 10 years in South Africa, and so have lived some of the realities, certainly that Sheikh Abdul Hakim mentioned, particularly the Indo-Pak communities of what used to be called the Transvaal is now called Gauteng, and KwaZulu-Natal, and having been there between the ages of 16 and 26, I think, certainly coming from the UK, and a very sort of atomized existence as a Muslim in the UK, living in a largely middle-class white suburban area, not really knowing many Muslims, to moving to South Africa, where suddenly you are, and it wasn't quite apartheid South Africa, it was just post-apartheid South Africa, but the communities were still very, very, very fixed in their groups, which was very interesting, because the first time I ever heard the adhan out loud was in South Africa, was in apartheid South Africa, at 6 years old, being called in masajid in the Indian areas. And the idea was that the degree of segregation was complemented by the idea that in your own area you can pretty much do your own thing. And so, in a perverse way, apartheid led to a form of flourishing of religious life that was not so much apparent in this country, in the UK, because you were pretty much left to your own devices. So to have that experience, and then to contrast the experience of the Indian community of Durban with this very strange Cape Malay community that seemed to be on a different planet entirely, where this was concerned, was very interesting. The reflection that I have, I think, is what can we learn about these two poles? Because what you see here is two Muslim communities in a very similar socio-political and socio-economic situation, who have two very different responses to the question of indigenization. How does that relate to our circumstance here in the UK if you were to compare, for example, the middle of Bradford or the middle of Alum Rock to London or to Cambridge, and the different experiences of Muslim communities in these areas? What similarities would you find? What differences would you find? What challenges would you find? And what can we, as a relatively young community, the Cape Malay Muslim community, 300 years old at least, the Indian, and it is Indian, the Indian community of South Africa, 150 years old. Here in this country, notwithstanding, of course, Abdullah Quilliam and the Yemenis that came in the early 1900s and so forth, the vast majority of Muslims in this country, 50 years old, maybe, 40, 50 years old. That sort of. What can we learn, actually, from the experiences of these communities? When I was coming down here, I was thinking about what would be an inverted commas, big inverted commas, an Islamic perspective on the question of indigenization, on the question of minority communities. And I'm aware that there are Mashayikh sitting with me on the panel, all three actually, Mashayikh sitting with me on the panel, and there are Mashayikh sitting in the audience as well, so I have to watch my tongue and possibly even my heart as well, what I say. But this is a vexed question. And from an Islamic perspective, I suppose you would look at a spectrum between urf and tashabbuh. So you have in the theoretical Muslim tradition, I'll put it that way for now, in the Islamic tradition, the idea of tashabbuh, the idea of imitation. You become what you imitate, effectively. Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum. The one who imitates a community is from among them. And there has always been an element of Islamic thinking that is about maintaining a distinct identity, of not being sucked into and assimilated completely by a foreign community. You find this all the way through Islamic thought. You find, for example, in Hanafi, even as a minority community in power, which is what the Muslim community was for hundreds of years in many of the lands that we now consider to be Muslim lands. You'll find Hanafi texts, for example, talking about, if you say Nowruz Mubarak, this is kufr. Basically, if you say Merry Christmas to a, inverted commas, defeated community, the Zoroastrian community that has been overcome by Islam, but the fear of assimilation into the Zoroastrian Persian mindset was so animated, the ulama, that they put these very strict alfaz, they call alfaz al-kufr, statements of warning about the dangers of assimilation, which are in the fiqh works. At the same time, you have an equally Islamically indigenous concept of al-urf muhakkama, that the custom of a people is legally binding, that there is accommodation for the customs of a people within Islam. So you have an element within Islam, theoretical Islamic thinking that leans in the direction of, big inverted commas again, multiculturalism, cultural expressions of Islam. And you have an element within theoretical Islamic thinking that relates to maintaining a distinct identity. And what I think you find, and again, I'm very hesitant to say things like this in front of Shaykh Abdul Hakim, these are just my reflections on this, is that Muslim communities in this context, communities that are politically minority as well as numerically minority, because they're not the same thing. We are saghirin in this context. We do not hold the levers of power in the UK, in South Africa. Where else have Muslims been in that circumstance? Well, in the Far East, in the Nusantran tradition, which was never conquered. There was never a military invasion and conquest by Muslims of the Far East. There was, as I forget who put it, but it was very beautiful the way it was put, that Islam did not come to our shores like a tsunami that destroys everything that came before it. It came wave upon wave, each wave rising, sinking into the sand and becoming part of the land. And the region was transformed in this way by Islam. So in these contexts, the other obvious context, of course, is China. The Han Chinese experience, which is a 1,200-year-old, still going. When we think about China and Islam now, we think about the Uyghurs. But the Uyghurs, again, maintained a very distinct cultural identity and always have. And that's the problem that they have at the moment, is the distinct cultural identity being really stamped upon. Whereas you have the majority of Muslims in China, even up to this day, are Han Chinese. They are ethnically, culturally Chinese, but theologically Muslim. So what was the experience of the Han Chinese in a radically different but totalizing culture of China, of Confucianism, a radically different epistemological system where the language itself is written in ideograms, in pictures. How do you represent a formless, transcendent God pictorially? I mean, this is the question that the Chinese Muslims struggled with. But what you see in each of these societies is a tendency that leans towards a degree of assimilation whilst holding on to what is centrally Islamic, and a tendency that leans towards de-assimilation, towards a form of segregation. in order to maintain that which is centrally Islamic. And it's very interesting to live that, and to live in one pole of that community in the years when my understanding of Islam was formed. To see the limitations of that, as Shaykh Abdul Hakim, for example, has mentioned about the fact that religious exclusivism can very easily, in that context, become cultural, ethnic exclusivism. Islam is a religion for brown people, not white people and not black people, but brown people. Versus the Cape Townian experience. Now, looking at it from that Indian perspective, the Cape Townians, it's like they'd lost their religion. Who are they? Are they even Muslim? Now, of course, nobody disagrees that they're Muslim. There's no takfir. But there is this sense that they're not really Muslim. They're kind of Muslim. Right? And that is not just the Deobandi Islam of the Indo-Pak areas of South Africa. It is also the Barelvi Islam. And to a certain extent, it is also the Sufi Islam. The Islam of Sufi Sahib, of Basha Pir, and of the tradition that I come from, which is neither Deobandi nor Barelvi. But there is, you see, that element of we need to preserve our Indian Islamic culture, even in that community. And I see a similar sort of parallel. It's not exactly the same, but a similar parallelism with what is happening and the discussions, whether among ulama, whether among ordinary Muslims on the street in this country. How do I preserve my Muslimness? And to what extent does that identity reach? How authentically Islamic can I be if I engage in a degree of cultural assimilation, linguistic assimilation, and so forth? So these are very interesting and live questions, and there's a lot to learn from the older communities that have come before us. And I would say, just to finish, despite coming from the one pole, I have always found that I naturally identified more with this pole. And I did meet Shaykh Seraj, I remember now. A long time, I didn't know who he was, I didn't know what it meant, but I do remember now. I do remember meeting him, mashallah. And I've always had I was a slightly traitorous affinity for the Cape Islam, which I found touched something within me.
You always had good taste.
I had a good taste.
Thank you. Okay, please.
Yeah, given that you've all spoken about your connection to South Africa, I had the enormous privilege of spending 10 weeks living with a Moravian Christian community in a little village, maybe 2 hours from Cape Town, called Mamre. And it was one of these DFID schemes, so they pack together 16 to 25-year-olds and send them off volunteering to the developing world, and you go out there and you pick up some skills and learn something about these sustainable development challenges that we talk about. But my anecdote kind of really will pick out what you've all said, is that when I went to Cape Town, the group there, I was traveling with a group of 15 young people like myself. This was in 2009. When we went into Cape Town, we managed to get into the mosques for Friday prayers. For some of the Muslims, there was a Muslim girl from Birmingham. She had never been to a mosque before. Me taking her to a mosque in Cape Town was her first experience of Jummah, and this is a Muslim girl. When we went on our road trip and got to Durban, that was the first place I wasn't allowed in a mosque. And this kind of there's a real parallel here with the experience of Muslim women in this country as well, where there are particular areas in the country where if you want to go and pray inside the mosque, it's very difficult for you to go in, even if the mosque is empty, because there are only men allowed in those mosques. And I did reflect at the time as well, is this because of these are Indian areas, and so we've kind of lifted out some of those interpretations that don't open up these spaces as much to all members of our community. or is there something else going on here? And I didn't get down to the bottom of it, but yeah, we've heard a few things today. And, you know, linked to that, I think when we're talking about spaces, Hisham, you mentioned the Zawiya of Shaykh Seraj. I have found it quite challenging to find spaces within our community where you can feel welcome, you can go in and have that spiritual reflection. And over the last few years, I've been twice now to a Benedictine monastery. It's off the coast of California. It's a silent monastery. It's a working monastery, so you have there are 10 to 13 monks who live there, and they've chosen this monastic life for themselves, but they're also very happy to open up that space for guests. And I think I found my spiritual home in the world, because I can go there, I can be in the presence of these godly people, I can reflect on my own faith commitments, but also feel very safe whilst doing so. And I would love to see us, you know, in the UK, hopefully over time, developing spaces where all members of our community feel that, you know, they can connect with their faith, with their spirituality, with what is transcendent that we are kind of reaching out to. But yeah, those are some of my anecdotes from my travels. And in Iran, you know, going to see the Zoroastrian temples, you know, the local Muslims in Iran take great pride in their heritage, whether it's their kind of architectural heritage, their poetry, or their temples. And you know, I had very devout Shia Muslims kind of taking me around to visit these temples, and now at any one point did they say, oh, this is the bit of our history we want to you know, forget about or hide or get rid of. It was very much a part of their narrative and their understanding of their identity. When Hisham asked me to join this panel, I was very reluctant, because I don't really like questions of identity. My own personal approach has always been, you know, not to think about the fact that I may be a minority as an ethnic minority or a religious minority or a gender minority. It's always been to see myself as a person and engage with the world around me in that sense. So it's really forced me into a space in the last kind of week that I didn't want to be in, which was to reflect on what it means for me, what this question means of indigenizing Islam. And essentially it is a question of identity, because it comes down to, you know, how it is that we, you know, the things that form our identity, how it is that we connect with other people of the same identity within a group setting. And I realized that actually my version is much broader than that. So I have now, over the last few years, you know, maybe the last 5 years, my moral community is not just the Muslim community. It has extended now to other communities who I feel are kind of paying attention to the world in a different way, and is through that moral lens that, you know, I feel that I'm connecting to these groups. But questions of identity are important, because not only do they kind of shape our own practices and what we do, but sometimes they shape what other people do to us as well. And given the fact that I wear a hijab, I don't have, although internally I'm not constantly thinking as a Muslim woman, I'm just thinking, you know, as an ethical person, what would I do today, or what's required of me in this particular space? I am every day kind of faced with the pre-made judgments of the people who view me primarily through the lens of a Muslim woman. And I think what's really interesting about identity is that we have so many different kinds of identities that contour us as people. We'll have our religious identity, our ethnic identities. You know, there's so many different aspects to ourselves. But the world can sometimes choose for us what is our primary identity that we are kind of then situated through and viewed through and engaged with. Whereas we as individuals may be peering through our kind of a different identity every day to look into the world and navigate some of those challenges that we face and see around us. And that's like a very, just I think of talking more about the subjective experience here and what it kind of means day to day. to engage with these multiple identities, to come in and out of them, to have them shape our decisions and what we do. But from a kind of aspirational perspective, what would I really like from the Muslim space and the Muslim community is for us to broaden our sense of community, to really think about how it is that we can form those deep and meaningful relationships with people who don't kind of share our creedal beliefs, i.e. they're not from the same religion. And how can we really, you know, this sacred interpretive tradition that is deeply humanist in its endeavor, how can we find ways of bringing that into conversation with other traditions, in a sense that you don't lose the core of what is there, the centrality as Asim Yusuf spoke about, but you can really enhance the applicability of that tradition and actually allow that tradition itself to mature. There is really this lack of maturity, I feel, that we have in the way that we deal with our tradition, and that can come across as quite harsh. I don't mean to be offensive to anyone, but it would be great for us to find that maturity in our tradition, because there are so many big questions that, and this is the space that I've chosen to work in, is a space of technology, it's a space of thinking to the future. And it's very challenging to find the right language, to find the right concepts in order to bring our tradition into conversation with the big questions of our time. And so when we are engaging with our tradition and we're in dialogue with it in the past, we need to also bring it into dialogue in the present, and also into dialogue with the future, because we are creating that tradition for future generations as well. I think those are my very sporadic, non-scholarly thoughts.
Those were very scholarly thoughts, and they were much appreciated, I'm sure. One thing that I'd say in comment before handing over to Julian was Shaykh Seraj was very fond of a particular phrase. He called it radical tradition. And what I took from that with him was this idea of engaging incredibly relevantly to his surroundings and indeed with other communities, while remaining, again, incredibly rooted to a very traditional understanding of his religion. And he didn't find that to be, a straitjacket. He actually found it incredibly liberating.